Hey guys, last part of this section of the review for the second unit. It's got a few more big topics left to cover, so let's just kind of get those really quickly. All right, let's get started. All right, so the next big trend we want to talk about, big ideas from this unit, are these big cultural changes that are taking place in the colonies. So we talked about this in class. Let's just kind of go over it again. Uh, there's a large number of people, different people, kind of coming to the Americas. If we look at this map here, we can see at this chart down here at the bottom that there is a fairly diverse number of groups coming from Europe. A couple things. Why does this matter? How does this impactful towards American history? One, there's this whole idea that America is a melting pot, but we've talked about that. That's not entirely true. The bigger impact in terms of this time of history, is that if you start looking at the list of people list on here, right, you'll begin to notice that there's Scots, Irish, Swedish, Welsh, German, Dutch, and English. The thing is, as we get closer and closer to the revolution, the trend of immigration is upward. We're talking about right on the eve of the revolution. There's roughly 2 million people living in the colonies, right? So what that means is that these 2 million people aren't all that English anymore. As you can see, there's plenty of ethnic groups, right? So those people are definitely not English. And then if we talked about this in class, all this pink represents English settlements or English areas or dominated areas by English people. These were settled first. So many of the people who are living there who are quote English have been living in the colonies for several generations. How deeply are they feeling how deeply connected are they feeling back to England? Probably not a lot, right? So all of this is going to contribute to this notion that we're not going to be deeply connected to English, and will make it a lot easier to break away, especially when we start talking about some of the things that they did to us later on in the colonial period. Now, obviously, the other large group that you see here, scattered especially in the South, are going to be African slaves, right? We've already talked about why there was that shift from indentured servants to African slaves, but we didn't really talk about the transatlantic slave trade. Just a couple terms I want to throw at you. It's called the triangle trade, right? That was a system of trade that basically worked in the way that basically slaves were brought from Africa to the Caribbean or America to do hard labor, to produce raw materials or goods. Those then materials and raw materials and goods would then be sent to England or Europe, right? Where there would be manufacturing, where they would turn it into finished goods. And then they would send finished goods and other products to Africa to help get or pay for slaves. So essentially, in the triangle trade, every side of it supported the other side. They were all dependent on each other. Um, the other major term we kind of want to throw in here as well is the term the Middle Passage. That was the famous section of the Triangle Trade that brought Africans to the Americas. It is notorious for its brutality and violence and death. Um, we talked about how, in some cases, these ships would be so packed, and the reason they were so packed with slaves is because diseases and other issues could lead to essentially half of the people on the boat dying. And so, from a business perspective, the slave trade needed to ensure they were making money. Uh, and the last thing I'll mention about the slave trade, and then move on here for a second, is that the impact of the slave trade on American history and the world economy is hard to even begin to measure. It was entangled in everything, especially as we go deeper into American history. The analogy I've heard used, and I think it's pretty accurate, is this: in our modern world, every industry uses computers, or is dependent on computers, or is connected to computers. Just because you don't make the computer or design the programs doesn't mean that your job or your career isn't dependent upon that. That's essentially what slavery was. It didn't matter what the field was or industry was, in some way, shape, or form, you made money off of slavery, or you needed slavery to help run your industry. All right, and the last thing I kind of want to mention here is this, and this is actually really important. If we start looking at this section of the map right here, the Appalachian Mountains, you'll notice that we start seeing a large collection of immigrants that are not English, right? We're seeing a lot of Germans, we're seeing lots of Scots-Irish, and they're settling in the Appalachian Mountains, right? Why? All right, think about this, and we talked about it before. The first settlers were all English. What did they get? The good land. They got all the land that basically was on the coast that would have been helpful for, particularly in the South, for plantations. So when they got here and all that land was taken, they had to go into the mountains. Now, the problem with mountain farming is it's not very lucrative. It's very difficult to do. You're very disconnected from society, and South was already pretty disconnected based on their plantations. Um, what this will lead to will be this growing resentment between the elite planters of, the plains areas down here and these poor farmers, and basically they're people just scraping out a living. That animosity and tension will boil over. We'll see things like the Paxton Boys and the regulators, but also going ahead to the Civil War, right? Thinking a little bit further ahead down the line, when we start looking at the counties that decided to secede, the mountain counties in the South primarily wanted to stay in the Union, which will also explain why when we get further out here into places like Kentucky, right? Kentucky did not secede and join the South. They stayed in the North. They stayed with the federal side because, well, they didn't have deep affiliation. They actually had resentment towards wealthy planters in the South who owned slaves because they basically felt like they were being taken advantage of. All right. Other major cultural changes that we start seeing. Again, we're trying to explain how we're getting to revolution, right? So the next big one is the Enlightenment. Just to kind of summarize what the Enlightenment is or was, it was an intellectual movement that starts in Europe, that was kind of a branch off the scientific revolution. It was designed to take the scientific process, logic and reason, observation, and apply it to larger, broader societal things and problems. So, hey, government doesn't work. Why is there such inequality? What are the problems? And so several writers emerged from here to talk about this. But the one that we probably care the most about is going to be John Locke, for a couple of reasons. First, John Locke is going to outline the idea of natural rights. Again, what natural rights are the things that you were born with, right? For him, it was life, liberty, and property, right? Every human being, regardless of who they are, have the right to these things. Why is that significant? Well, we kind of stole almost the exact line and put it in our documents. So there's that. The other thing that John Locke puts in here that is significant is he believes that the people have the right to overthrow a government that does not protect their natural rights. The number one job of a government is protect my natural rights. If they fail to do it, you can get rid of them. He basically openly challenged in some of his writing the mere idea of a monarchy. What makes somebody by blood the better off and more suited to lead? The answer is nothing. And he pointed to history and said, all these terrible kings, they weren't qualified, and yet somehow they were able to be the leaders. Now, there are other names that are significant, right? You could talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who really focused on the idea of freedom of speech and this idea that we are something called the social contract. We're all in this together. The other major name I would probably throw in here as well would be Montesquieu, who looked at the English system of checks and balances and pushed that forward, that is a vital thing for a government to have. He also talked about the importance of a engaged, non-apathetic society in a democracy. Without engagement, democracy will fail. Those ideas all eventually clearly get circulated into our culture, into our government. Yeah, you can see I have Ben Franklin right here, right? Ben Franklin is a significant figure through American history, but what we care about in terms of the Enlightenment is that he made all his money by printing. He was a very famous printer. He was probably the most famous printer in the all the colonies. He had Poor Richard's Almanac. He published newspapers, but the reason he's so significant to the Enlightenment is, all right, these ideas were European. They're on the other side of the ocean. Ben Franklin was largely responsible for taking these ideas and kind of pushing them out to the masses through publications. So if it wasn't for him and his publications and his print shop, many of these ideas from the Enlightenment may have just come here and died or not gone anywhere. So he's directly responsible for the spread of these ideas because, again, you can't have a revolution unless you have support, right? So he helps build that support. All right. Other big ideas. Self-rule. I talked about it before with the Mayflower Compact. We're essentially talking this idea that America has always been very much interested in ruling themselves. So there was the Mayflower Compact. We already talked about that. I won't talk about it again. But the House of Burgesses, which is in Virginia. Now, it was designed to be this bicameral system with an upper house and a lower house. Um, does that sound familiar, right? A bicameral system. Uh, the reason it was created was because as we've talked about, Virginia was awful. No one wanted to live there. And so there are no women. You're gonna 50-50 chance of dying. What you got? So what did they come up with as a marketing ploy? Oh, England, you have no voice in the government. Come to Virginia, you'll have a voice in the government. So they basically kind of made this as an attempt to kind of give another reason for people to come. They could participate in the system. Now, Bacon's Rebellion exposed it as being deeply corrupt. The lower house were basically only people in the lower house had to be landowners, which limited who could be members, which basically meant all those indentured servants. Nah. And then the upper house was handpicked by the governor. They served as judges, and they typically did whatever the governor told them to do because they liked having that access and the opportunities that came with it. So again, it's not really great democracy. It's not, but it is the idea of self-rule is there, right? And we're going to expect it. And essentially, almost every colony will have it at some point or another. All right, shifting gears. So we start to see what essentially are challenges to self-rule. Um, Mercantilism is this policy that was adopted by almost every single country in Europe except for the Dutch that basically said the colonies exist to make money. All the resources and benefit of the colony needs to go back to the mother country, the country that owns the colony or runs the colony. And so, with that in place, it basically one creates brutal competition, right? The idea of mercantilism is that there's a pie, and for every dollar or every piece of that pie that I lose, somebody else is gaining. So trading with other nations hurts you. You need to basically make sure that you are making everything for yourself. The other issue here is that besides not trading with other countries, it breeds tremendous competition and an exploitive relationship between the mother country and the colonies. You are there to basically be used. You can use your imagination, what word. But yeah, you're there to basically do whatever they tell you to do, and you have no choice. And we see that come into play when we start talking about the Navigation Acts. We looked at these laws in class, right? The laws were incredibly harsh. They basically said you have to trade within the colonies, right? They laid out incredibly harsh penalties if you were caught breaking the rules. Remember, you would lose all your property, the boat, any supplies on it, any merchandise on it, and it would be sold off, and the revenue from that would be given to the crown, it would be given to the king, and basically anybody who helped turn you in. So it creates this kind of like police state, if you will. Um, and as we remember from class, first laws were kind of, hey, just trade everything in England, kind of generic stuff. But as the colonies continued to ignore these things or break these things, we saw the laws get more specific and designed to ensure as much of the resources went back to England. All right, so England had been putting these really harsh rules on the colonies for years. Well, then we get to salutary neglect. The name we want to know is Robert Walpole. He was the Prime Minister of England, but the thing was, he becomes Prime Minister through corruption. He essentially is giving away these government jobs in return for votes and support. And so the jobs he gives away are jobs in these trading houses where basically you would collect taxes or penalties. Well, here's the thing, it was a really lucrative job if you're willing to be a cheat. So people bribed these people in these positions to get around the laws. And so here's the thing, Robert Walpole basically stops enforcing the Navigation Acts because, well, not because he's some political genius or economic mastermind. No, he just is a corrupt politician and knows if he keeps pushing the laws, then he's going to get himself caught. All right, last thing, real quick, the Dominion of New England. All right, every colony had been ruled by themselves with permission from England, particularly New England. Um, the problem was the king decides that he wants to control all of them. So he removes all their legislative groups, removes their governors. He puts one person in charge, Edmund Andros. And essentially, it runs all of New England, even eventually includes New York. And the reason this was such a big problem was that the colonists, one, lost their ability to rule themselves and their voice locally, but also, more importantly, the king began to impose Anglican Church of England rules in a Puritan country, and that did not go well. Eventually, the Dominion of New England will be ended because the colonists object so much. But again, the idea is that we want to rule ourselves, don't take away our rights, and if you do, you'll deal with the consequences. All right, guys, I hope this has been helpful. I'll see you later.